This is Jump Through History with Mr. Dilly and Matt. This episode, The Princes in the Tower, What Really Happened.
Two young princes disappear inside the Tower of London. Their uncle becomes king. Shakespeare calls him a villain. But what if we've blamed the wrong man for 500 years?
Welcome to Jump Through History. I'm Mr. Dilly.
And I'm Matt.
And together in every episode, we jump into a different moment from the past.
One of us researches a story,
And the other discovers it live along with you.
and at the end, we spin the wheel of when to find out where we will jump to next.
Now, before we jump into our story today and our history today, there's something you need to know. Matt cannot be trusted to wear hats. I wear a hat, of course. I'm Mr. Dilly, but generally Matt cannot be trusted to wear a full-time hat. But we're going to jump into this anyway. It's time for Matt's Hats. So, Matt, there we... You see, I told you can't trust him. Matt, tell us, what hat have you got on there today? And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this is known as a deer stalker hat. It has origins from the 1800s, mainly used outdoors for hunting, especially up in the northern part of the country and further above that in Scotland as well. It's made very famous, though, with Sherlock Holmes' fantastic creation by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But interestingly, none of Conan Doyle's writings actually mention Holmes wearing a hat like this. It was from an illustrator called Sidney Paget. He drew Holmes wearing one of these in the Strand magazine, I think to sort of illustrate that Holmes was an outdoors person and also to help give him a distinctive silhouette for the drawing. And then when the early stage adaptations of the plays came out, and then some of the old black and white films, they all portrayed Holmes as wearing a deerstalker hat. So this is where it comes from. Matt's hat is this.
Matt's Hats. Thank you, Matt, for showing us your hat. So, Matt, where are we going for our Jump Through History episode today?
Well, we are going to England, and the year is 1483. And the situation is that the King of England, Edward IV, he has died quite suddenly. He's about 40 years old. I think up until in his youth, he was a very strong man, very fit man, very healthy, and he's very tall as well. But I think more recent times, his lifestyle had gone slightly downhill, which often has an adverse effect on you. And he died quite suddenly at about age 40. It might have been pneumonia. It might have been some sort of illness. They're not really sure. They don't really suspect anything sinister in that. But what it has left, it's left a bit of a void in terms of the heir to the throne. He has got two sons to succeed him, Edward, the eldest, and Richard, a younger brother. So Edward, the eldest, is about 12 years old, and his younger brother, Richard, is about 9. But of course, they're too young to be named king at this stage.
So everything's kind of okay at the moment then. So this whole, what's going to happen next? There's no suspicious situation or circumstances happening at the moment. So how does this sort of, and when does this start to sort of change then? And why?
Well, obviously, they're too young to rule by themselves, 12 years old and 9 years old. That'd be quite carnage being ruled by a 12-year-old, wouldn't it? A pre-teen.
I don't know, some of the children listening, other people listening might think that's a very good idea. And some of them may be doing a better job. Who knows?
I think it's interesting. You speak to children about what's going on in the world today, and they come out with some fantastic ideas. You think, well, why don't our leaders do that? So maybe we've missed a trick here all this time.
There you
But
go.
anyway, in those days, they weren't allowed to rule by themselves. And so what happened was the king's brother, Richard, he'd been ruling the north anyway, and he was very loyal to his brother. And he proved himself a very able general in the north of England as well. He was named as protector of the two boys, and the princes were moved to the Tower of London for their safety.
So the Tower of London, we all kind of know the Tower of London, and some of you listening might have. I've been to the Tower of London, so we tend to think of the Tower of London as a prison, really, or something like that. But it's not always that. So they're there for their safety. So how does that?
Absolutely. Look, as you're quite right. These days we look at the Tower of London as a prison, or as where people were kept and even executed in Tudor times, etc. And even in World War I, as a spy was shot there. But in those days, it was a royal residence. It wasn't really seen as a prison as such. So the fact that these two young princes have been taken to the Tower of London is not seen as anything really out of the ordinary at this stage. And for a long time, they're seen in the courtyard practicing with their archery, with their bows and arrows. And so, life is sort of continuing as usual. And the people of England are expecting a coronation for Edward to become Edward V. But gradually, as time goes by, they are seen less often. And by the late summer of 1483, there are no more sightings of these boys. And that's probably when the rumours begin.
So they just vanished, do they? They just literally stopped people to stop seeing them?
They did. People stopped seeing them. And I think what we're going to remember in those days is very different to times these days where words and rumours and everything can spread so quickly. In those days, it was very, very different. Things spread very, very slowly. And also, people were quite fearful of spreading rumours that could end up in them being in trouble themselves. Well, you'd probably know what's going to happen to you.
Yeah, I think it's at the end of that. Now, Matt's going to take us a little bit further with that, and we're going to find out a bit more about how this kind of developed. But before that, it's time for your questions with our History Hotline. Okay, so thanks for sending in your questions. You can send in your questions for every episode from any period of history we will try and answer your questions from. So first up today, here we go.
So this is a question for you, Mr. Dilly. This is from Luca from Harlan's Primary Academy. Why did the Vikings have shields on their boats?
Okay, I will attempt to answer this, Matt. The Vikings had shield on their boats, and obviously their boats were called long ships because, guess what? They were long ships. So I'm guessing the first reason is one for these shields. They're about 80 to 90 centimeters across, nearly a meter. So they're pretty big. So you don't want them clunking around on deck. So it's kind of useful place to actually put them, of course, to keep them out the way of the people trying to row the boat. But it's also about speed as well. You put them on the side of the boat there and they're ready to grab them, of course. Now we know these long ships were flat bottom boats. And what that meant is that they were quite difficult to row. They're jumping around on top of the waves, but they can also row right up onto a beach. If you've ever been in a boat, you have to kind of get out and drag it up if you're on a small boat. They can row right up to the beach. Now, if they can row right up on the beach, they can suddenly grab hold of their shields. They're ready to go. They're not clunking around under their seats. So you've got them this sort of access, and you've got space as well. It's also about intimidation. Can you imagine looking at the shore, seeing all these ships coming in? You've got the carvings of the dragon heads and other monsters at the front, and then you've got all these shields. And these shields obviously are acting for defense from arrows and stuff coming at the Vikings on the ship. The intimidation, they're painted in all kinds of colors and patterns and monsters and gods and all the rest of it. So you don't look like just visitors, you look like warriors. So the shields are not just for fighting, they kind of help the Viking long ships become a almost floating warning sign. So I hope that answers your question, Luca. Now, Matt, it's your question here. This is from Thomas at St. Richard Reynolds School. Why did Henry VIII have 6 wives?
It's a very good question, Thomas. Thank you for that. I think the main reason Henry VIII had 6 wives is because he was desperate for a male heir. He'd seen the trouble that his father, Henry VII, had gone to in terms of providing a male heir, because Henry VIII was never destined to be the king. In fact, it was his older brother, Arthur, that was all being geared up to be and prepared to be the next king. But he sadly died at 15, which all of a sudden thrust the young Prince Henry, who'd been prepared for life in the church, to suddenly become the next king. So he was very aware of that, and that sons could die at any time, all this sort of stuff could happen. So he was desperate to have a male heir. And when his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had been married to for almost 24 years, only provided him with a daughter, Mary, he then managed to move on to the next wife, Anne Boleyn, who also then gave him a daughter, Elizabeth. So then he moved on to the next wife, Jane Seymour. Now, she finally provided him with his son, Edward. But of course, he thought maybe one son isn't enough. So sadly, when Jane Seymour died, he moved on to Anne of Cleves. He wasn't particularly keen on Anne of Cleves, so he quickly got that marriage annulled, which is like a divorce in those times. And then on to Catherine Howard. But things didn't work out well there. And then he moved on to his last wife, Catherine Parr. So the main reason he had 6 wives was he was trying to provide as many heirs to the throne. Ideally, in those days, he wanted male heirs to the throne to make sure that the Tudor dynasty would continue.
Let's pick up from what Matt's telling us about this thing. So Prince had disappeared, and then Richard, the Protector, he becomes king. So where does he become king in all of this? And what do people think about this?
Well, it's interesting because he becomes king in 1483. He is now Richard III. But there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes here. As he sort of seized the throne in a way, it gives the opportunity for some other people to think, well, hang on, why don't we go over there and try and wrestle the crown from him? This could be a good moment with all that's going on over there. And so this is where Henry Tudor, he's been over in France. He lands in Pembroke in Wales, and he starts making his way up the country with an army, with a mercenary army, trying to gather people as he does to try and meet Richard in battle to try and seize the throne.
Can I just ask a quick question there, Matt, before you continue on that bit? Just so Henry Tudor, just to understand, who is this guy? He's just a sort of a nobleman or something in Europe? Who actually is he? And why does he think he can come over there and challenge Richard for the throne? Is there a reason for that?
Well, interestingly, he's got a very tenuous sort of link back. He's quite a minor noble, as it were. He's not one of the people you would think would come to try and seize the throne. And I think a lot of this comes from Henry's mother, a lady called Margaret Beaufort, who had these grand ideas for him and was encouraging this. And as we're going to see, she's got quite an important part to play.
So this is a defining moment. Richard's declared king. Princes and the two boys are now just sort of forgotten. They've just disappeared. And then the Henry Tudor, sort of like egged on by his mum, basically lands in England, and now he's gonna try and vie for Richard for the throne. He's going to try and take the throne from Richard. Is that right?
Absolutely. In those days, if you killed the king in battle, you could assume his position. And so his force are heading across to try and meet Richard. And this is where Richard sends Lord Thomas Stanley, who's one of the major nobles at the time. He sends him across and he says, make sure you don't let Henry's force get any closer. But interestingly, the Stanleys let Henry's force through.
Well, why do they do that? Just to basically see which way the tide turns. Fickle. Is that
They were very, very fickle. They're very much sort of hedging their bets to see which way it goes. But there's an interesting side to this. We mentioned Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother. Her first husband died and she has remarried Lord Thomas Stanley. So up until this point, the Stanleys have been, very much Yorkist men, loyal to the York family of York, which is Richard's family. However, there is this link to Henry Tudor, which I'm sure Richard was very aware of, which is probably why he sent the Stanleys there. Prove your loyalty, stand up for your king, and prevent this usurper from getting any closer. And of course, the Stanleys let them through.
Henry Tudor, he's coming with his army across England. Richard is then aware of he's landed, and he's coming with his army. So this Battle of Bosworth is the first time that they clash. Is that right? And whereabouts is this?
Absolutely. So this is in Market Bosworth, and this is in 1485. And I think, when they line up, it looks very much really like Richard should be victorious if you looked at the numbers on the battlefield, the numbers of soldiers, etc. like that. But things, quite quickly don't really go according to plan. I think some of the soldiers don't advance when he orders them to. I think it's the Duke of Northumberland. They're ordered to advance and they don't. They sort of just stay where they are. And what Richard does is he actually sees an opportunity to try and end the battle early. He actually sees Henry Tudor on the battlefield. And so he leads a charge. He leads a charge straight towards Henry Tudor. And he gets so close to him that Henry's flag bearer is killed. And it's at this time, the Stanleys are watching this from a hill overlooking the battlefield. And it's at this time that they head down the battlefield to get involved.
Just to sort of paint a picture for the listeners, do you know what sort of numbers we're talking about on the battlefield?
Well, Henry's army was smaller. They had about 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. Richard's had about 10,000 to 12,000, but that includes the Stanley family, which had between 4,000 and 6,000. So depending on who the Stanleys fight for, if the Stanleys fight for Richard, then he's got a much, much larger army. But if the Stanleys fight for Henry, then the two armies are very, very equal in size and number.
So that really was, one of the turning points is that Stanley getting involved in the battle then, who he decides to vouch for. And I guess he's just basically looking and going, okay, let's just see which way it swings, because he wants to make sure he's on the right side. Is that correct?
Absolutely. They want to make sure that they're on the winning side. Obviously, if they leave it too late and then the king ends up killing Henry, then they're probably going to be in trouble for not helping out Richard. But if they get there too early, so they're really waiting to see which way this is going to go. And of course, Henry and Richard probably don't know which side they're going to come down on.
What's the sort of finale? How does it what's the decisive point? How does it end?
Well, Richard has managed to get through to where Henry's bodyguards are. As we said, the flag bearer has been killed for Henry, and it's looking really, really desperate. And this is when the Stanleys come down from the hill and they launch themselves into the battle. But they start attacking Richard, the king, and his men. And this is where Shakespeare says in his play that Richard is shouting, treason, treason, and my kingdom for a horse, and all this sort of stuff. There's probably no doubt that he does get unseated from his mound, but he continues fighting bravely on foot, surrounded in a thicket of enemies until he is hacked down and he is killed on the battlefield.
Wow, and so as soon as he gets killed, that's the end of the battle, is it? With the king's dead, that's it? Is that what signals the end?
That is the end of the battle, and the crown is found in a bush, and it is placed upon Henry's head by Lord Thomas Stanley. And interestingly, after Henry becomes king, he backdates his reign to before the Battle of Bosworth. And this is basically saying that I'm not just king because I won in battle, I was the rightful king anyway. And what that also means is, quite cleverly, that anybody that fought against him at Bosworth, he can then say, you fought against your king. I'm going to punish you and fine you and take all your land and money.
So Henry actually becomes king there and then on the battlefield.
That's how he's then seen as king. Obviously, there's an official coronation, etc. later. But as I said, when at the coronation later on, he actually predates his reign to before the battle, which is quite clever in a way, and quite a bit unfair, I suppose, if you fought against him because you thought you were fighting for your king, and then you were told, well, actually, no, you fought against your king.
Just looking at this whole thing so far, Matt, that fairness is not a word that comes into any of it.
No, it's not.
It's incredible. This is a really important part. So you can just say, Damasus said about the backdating, it's almost kind of like completely wipes out Richard from the record. But now we sort of go to this other thing, which kind of links back to a couple of other things, is that linking back to the princes in the tower and linking back now to Richard, and now how Richard is portrayed and how that sort of whole idea of the princes in the tower gets linked to him. And he really, well, tell us how he's now, up until recently actually, sort of perceived by people in the public and why he's looked at like that. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, what we've got to realise, Mr. Dilly, is that now it's Tudor England. It is ruled by the Tudors. It's ruled by Henry VII and later on Henry VIII. In particular, we're looking at that sort of frame of time. So it's very much a Tudor period. And so therefore, what the Tudors want to do is they want to show how great the Tudors are, but also how awful and terrible anybody was before them, especially somebody that they've sort of usurped and killed on the battlefield to seize their position. So anything they can do to sully, to blacken the name of the previous king, they're going to do. In a way, this is essentially, I suppose, Tudor propaganda. And so this is where the Tudor historians really start putting out the dirt on Richard III, saying that he is this evil, hunchbacked killer of his own nephews. And there's one famous propagandist, is that a word?
It is now. You've just propagandist. Matt, that's Matt's word. You can use it. Propagandist.
There's one famous propagandist that you might well have heard of, the Bard himself.
Shakespeare. So this is the interesting thing. So obviously, all the children listening, even if you haven't read it about it, would read any of him, would have heard of William Shakespeare. So what's Shakespeare got to do with the image of Richard, and then the link again with the whole thing with the princes in the tower and all that kind of stuff? What's he got to do with that?
Well, of course, this is Tudor England, where Shakespeare became famous. He was putting on his plays at the Globe and other areas. And the plays were very, very popular in those days. And one of his plays, of course, was Richard III. And this is where he portrayed Richard as an evil, hunchbacked killer, a really nasty, nasty piece of work. And a lot, people, they believe what they see, they believe what they hear. So this is what they're hearing about Richard. This is what they're seeing about Richard. So this is really where it takes off. And as Shakespeare goes from strength to strength and becomes more and more famous, then this is seen as the gospel truth about the person that Richard actually was.
So really, if that wasn't the truth, and Shakespeare had sort of shown the truth, he would have been sort of, done himself, wouldn't he? So I guess he has to kind of write what the leaders kind of say he should write at the time.
Absolutely. He's got to toe the line here, hasn't he? And do what...
He's got to toe the line and write the line. There we go. So the winners basically are the ones who are telling the story, not the losers. So we get the winner's story. Is that correct?
Of course. And I think in another one that does this is a very famous man at the time called Sir Thomas More. He wrote a book about the history of England, and a very graphic passage about the death of the princes and how they're supposed to have died. But what we've got to remember is, Thomas More was a young child when this happened, a very, very young child. So, and nobody saw what happened. And he was raised himself by a guy called John Morton, that gave him sort of patronage and looked after him. And John Morton was an archbishop under Henry Tudor, so very much a Henry VII man. But also John Morton had been an enemy of Richard, and they'd fallen out quite badly. So John Morton hasn't got a very good impression of Richard. He influences Thomas More, who writes this book later on. And that's where you get these famous pictures of the murder of the princes in the Tower with, I think, John Dighton and Miles Forrest pressing the pillow against their heads and stuff. But none of this was seen. But this is the image. This is the work that's been pushed out through literature, through paintings, through books in the world.
It's really interesting that because it's like as you said, that word propaganda. About presenting something other than it is, possibly in order to get a message across, and then that becomes what's believed and what isn't accepted. But that's not the truth. Now, what we're going to do, Matt, okay, I know there's some alternative theories, and we want to know also why this happens and why it matters to us today. But before we do that, what do we have coming up?
Each episode, we're going to delve into the archive of Mr. Dilly's world of silly. So you're going to find us something from your world of silly, a ridiculous, a surprising, or just plain unbelievable fact from history. And I'm sure there are many of those to choose from.
Mr. Dilly's World of Silly!
Okay, so Mr. Dilly's World of Silly this week. We're jumping into the year 1325 and the Italian cities of Modena and Bologna. And now these cities are fierce rivals already. But this wasn't just a petty neighbourhood squabble. The two cities were caught in a much bigger sort of struggle, political struggle, if you like, that have been clashing across Italy for generations, really. So basically, this is quite a weird one. What is Mr. Dilly's World of Silly? What do you expect? So when the men from Modena, they end up with a wooden bucket that they've stolen from Bologna, and it becomes the sort of perfect symbol of this long-going insult and clash of rivals between these two cities. Bologna, they want the bucket back. Give us back our bucket. Modena say, no, you're not having back the bucket. Tempers rise. Armies gather, and an argument explodes into what became known as the War of the Bucket. I know, ridiculous. Okay. Now, to be fair, historians think that it wasn't just caused by a bucket, of course. The bucket becomes famous because it's the most gloriously ridiculous kind of trophy there is. But the real cause, as I said, were political rivalry and raids and revenge and power struggles between the two cities and states over a period of time. The most famous is actually this battle. It's called the Battle of Zappolino. Great name for a battle. And this is on the 15th of November, 1325, when Modena defeat Bologna, despite Bologna having a much bigger force. So the bucket did not really start everything from nothing, but it became the perfect, silly symbol of a very serious feud. And you can actually see the bucket because the bucket still survives. Yes, the bucket survives. And it's in Modena today, and it's a very popular historical object that people go and see. So it's not really a war about a famous piece of DI equipment. It's a bit of medieval power struggle that just happens to leave history one of the most funniest trophies imaginable. A wooden bucket that becomes a symbol of taking an argument just a little bit too far. And that is the end of today's Mr. Dilly's World of Silly.
Mr. Dilly's World of Silly!
Okay, Matt, so we're going to finish up here with our story here. So there's various sort of alternative theories about why all this happened. You mentioned a couple of them about what happened to the princes in the Tower, and then kind of how the sort of Tudor dynasty sort of progresses from there. But tell us a few of the other sort of theories as well about what was going on at the time.
Yeah, and I think one thing to remember that, this isn't to say that Richard didn't do it. I think what we're trying to do is to try and look at things and say, he may have done it, he may not have done it. It's important to look at other pieces of evidence and not just blindly trust what we hear and what we say, especially when it's written by the winners. So as we said, there's no contemporary eyewitness to this murder. So but then what we need to look at is the motives of people. So, Richard, I suppose, yes, he did have motive. However, an Act of Parliament had said that the children were illegitimate, and so he did have the right to rule, and he'd made himself king. So from that point of view, you could argue that he didn't need to get rid of them because an Act of Parliament had recognised them as illegitimate and him as the king. So did he need to get rid of them? So then we look at somebody like Henry Tudor, who later became Henry VII, though he certainly had motive there because he could not be king whilst they were still alive. And so it was vital for them to be out of the picture if he was going to become King of England.
In theory, it might have nothing to do with Richard whatsoever. It might do, as you said, but it might have to do with people working behind the scenes for Henry Tudor to come in, not Richard. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And one of the characters is a gentleman named Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. And he was in charge of the Tower of London. So he had access to the two boys. And originally he was one of Richard's men. But then something happened between them and they fell out. And I think the Duke of Buckingham, he actually went over to France where Henry Tudor was in exile before the Battle of Bosworth. And so we know what happened in the meeting of those two people, what was discussed.
Yeah.
And then when he comes back, the Duke of Buckingham, he's arrested by Richard and accused of treason, and he is executed. So, we don't know what happened there. So Henry Stafford may have been working for Henry Tudor as well. We don't actually know.
It's like a whole, world of intrigue, isn't it? I mean, it's all these sort of, and as we said earlier, but we are presented with this picture that in this time, there's all these things and still nobody knows. But there's a couple of other things that happen. Am I right in thinking this? So the prince's bodies, have they ever been found, or what are the alternative theories about that?
Well, some bones of two bodies were found in 1674. This was in the reign of Charles II. I think some workmen were renovating one of the staircases there, and they found some bones that looked like they could have come from two children of that sort of age. The bones were buried in Westminster Abbey. However, the only way to find out if they are from the two princes is to basically forensically look at them with DNA evidence. And to do that needs royal permission. And previously under Elizabeth II, she had refused all of that. And so far, Charles III has as well. But should it get royal permission, maybe the mystery will be solved once and for all.
This is an incredible story. Still to this day, we don't actually know the answer. We still don't know the answer to it. It's just a great mystery of history. But see what I did there, Matt? Mystery of history. Wonderful. So mystery of history. Why does it matter to us today to learn about this and know about this?
I think it's a number of things, Mr. Dilly. I think it's a great unsolved mystery for a start. I think, as we've spoken, it's a fantastic story and it goes off in so many different directions and things you can delve into it. And it still fascinates us today. It also shapes how we judge Richard III, especially without knowing too much more about any of the backstory or the motives. We just believe what we're told by Shakespeare and other things. We see him as a villain. And it shows, I think, as we both touched on, how history can be shaped and written by the winners. But also it does raise modern questions about evidence and how we look at evidence and how we compare evidence and how we can find out what actually happened. And it still influences culture today.
That's absolutely fascinating, Matt. Now, that is the end of that particular topic today, but we got to find out, Matt, where we're going to be going for the next episode of Jump Through History. Let's get ready for The Wheel of When.
The Wheel of When.
So, nice and dramatic there, Matt. So the Wheel of When, for those listening, so the Wheel of When, as we spin the Wheel of When and we find out where we go for the next episode of Jump Through History. On the Wheel of When are all kinds of topics. We've got history's biggest whodunits. We've got things like empires and explorers, rebels and revolutions, royal drama, so on and so forth. So in a minute, Matt, when I spin the Wheel of When, what's going to happen?
It's going to spin round. It's going to select one of those topics, and then it's going to be your turn, Mr. Dilly, to go and research something along those topics. And then next episode, you're going to present it. I'm going to listen. I'm going to learn, and hopefully ask you some tricky questions.
Great. Okay. So let's see where the Wheel of When lands on for me to go and research and all us to discover with Matt for the next episode. So here we go. Where are we going? Where are we going? Where are we going? Oh, rebels and revolutions has come up on the Wheel of When. So, that's quite a big one, isn't it? But that's what's going to come up on next episode, Rebels and Revolutions. So tune in to find out where I jump to in history for that. Remember also to send in your random questions for our history hotline. And I hope you enjoyed this jump today with myself and Matt. So Matt, it just leaves us to say one thing. And thank you for joining us as we continue our Jump Through History.
Follow Jump Through History for more real history, big stories, and unexpected adventures.